Hello everyone, this is Mathfinder, the home for every math nerd's Pathfinder optimization needs. If you're new here, welcome and we're so glad to have you. If you've been here before, welcome back and thank you so much for continued support. Today's video is gonna be one last video before I get back to the Marshall series that I promised in the video linked above. Bear with me, I am sorry, the Marshall series is coming, but today's video is about a review for Paizo's newest book, Pathfinder Lost Omens, The High Seas, and it is a book filled with lore that's all about the high seas and various island nations all across Golarion. It's got a ton of fabulous setting information for GMs to use, and a couple of interesting subsystems that a GM might be interested in using or a player might be interested in engaging with by asking their GM, and quite a few cool new feats, items, and spells that we should talk about. So let's get into some of these things. Before we get into the video properly, a technical disclaimer. I have been trying to fix my audio issues, so for this video and for many of my upcoming videos, please leave a comment saying if the audio was good, bad, too quiet, too loud, had too much noise, echo, popping, whatever issues you see, and I'll try and tune it as best as possible for future videos. So the first thing I want to talk about is some of the GM-facing guidance presented in this book. There are 3 types of naval conflict subsystems presented within this book. There are boarding combats, there are naval ship-to-ship combats, and there are naval chases. Now, naval chases did not seem like particularly innovative or interesting because they just feel like chases, but with the obstacles flavored and textured a little differently with different skills and items involved. But boarding combats and naval combats were both interesting enough that I want to talk about them explicitly. So let's first talk about boarding combats. More or less, all boarding combats is a recommendation for running regular tactical combat, the one where player characters and their enemies roll initiative and duke it out with 3 action turns, but with really unique terrain. This might not seem like much, but I do wish Paizo did this kind of stuff way more often, and I'll explain why at the end of the slide. The setup for boarding combats is simple. It is typically 2 ships with a gap of 5 feet or less between them, though it can be more. 5 feet is just the recommendation that they give if you want players to be easily able to leap across from one ship to the other, but that's not something you have to do. And there's an added recommendation that when you're doing this combat, instead of using one battle map with 2 ships drawn on it, you should do 2 battle maps that are sort of connected at their edges, and then every round or 2 rounds, you should sway those battle maps like collinear to one another to represent the fact that there's motion going on from around, like things shift relative from the perspective of each of the 2 ships. I felt that was pretty interesting. Imagine a character that's taking range attacks from one ship and then things slowly move away from them. They have to reposition because of that. I felt that was a really interesting recommendation that you could not just use for ship combats, but also for other styles of combats. For example, if you're in a moving vehicle and there's enemies coming around you. And then boarding combats come with a whole list of terrain and feature suggestions. It mentions a whole lot of different things. For example, it mentions rigging and ropes, which you can either swing from part of a ship to another part of the same or different ship using an acrobatics check, or climb onto for a height advantage with an athletics check. It mentions having some kind of a chance of being knocked overboard, which is as simple as applying some force movement, and then once players are in the water, maybe there should be debris and objects from this conflict that they can use to position themselves to then either get back on the ship or just stay still. And when knocked overboard, you can probably also incorporate the whole like movement of maps thing. Like maybe when the maps move 10 feet, the waves are actually going to move the player closer to 30 feet or something like that, and make being knocked overboard a really scary prospect. Then they consider having things like gangplanks to cross the gap between the 2 ships if the leap distance is too long, or if the action economy for the leap is a little awkward. And then maybe there's balance checks to cross the gangplank. Then it suggests doing things like using the deck itself as a hazard. Portions of the deck of the ship can be damaged. You get on it, there's a reflex save to avoid falling through to the lower deck, and if you do fall through the lower deck, now your whole plan might go awry. You may have to climb back up, go the long way around and come up the stairs and figure out something else to do with your turn. And finally, it mentions the sway of the ship and water coming overboard and things like that, causing difficult terrain or greater difficult terrain, or in extreme circumstances, uneven terrain even, that requires you to constantly have to balance. Now, with these terrain and feature suggestions, the book says you should go easy with the terrain. You shouldn't be going too hard. It shouldn't be renewing itself too frequently. I say you should go crazy with the terrain. In my experience, when you have an experienced bunch of tactical optimized players, combats don't tend to last so long that you should only be doing these things every 2 turns or so. I think you should have an insane amount of terrain. You should have multiple of these things happening, and maybe the sway of the ship matters every round, not every 2 rounds, and it will make combats interesting and dynamic and memorable. You can't do this for every single combat, of course, but if you're having, say, a cinematic ship battle sequence in the middle of an existing campaign that has otherwise normal Pathfinder combats, it'll make it a lot of fun, and it'll be a really fun change of pace. And I really loved seeing this section. I love seeing this whole section on boarding combats because all it is a recommendation for GMs to not just look at combats as math. There is a tendency in the online community and online discourse to look at Pathfinder combats as being all about their mathematical side, all about the XP budget, all about whether it's severe or extreme, how many spell slots you use, how many slows you inflict, how many +1s and -1s you get. And it is really nice to have a book explicitly telling you, no, combats are about more than that. I know the GM Core has a section on dynamic combat encounters, and I've spoken in the video linked above about myths about building combat encounters in Pathfinder, but it is nice to have this reinforced. It is nice to have explicit suggestions for how GMs should build these dynamic encounters that go into specifics. The GM Core guidance is nice in general, but specific guidance like this is always going to be good. Imagine if Draconic Codex, for example, had rules on how you can incorporate a subsystem and a combat into one for fighting dragons. Perhaps the subsystem is to make that dragon land and stop flying around, and then the combat encounter comes later in a fair fight with the dragon, because dragons are notoriously overtuned for their levels. Stuff like that could really flesh out these Lost Omens books, and I hope to see more of that from Paizo in the future. Of course, another good example of these kinds of rules is Battlecry's skirmish rules, which is also an alternative type of tactical combat that uses the same rules as normal Pathfinder combat, but applies clever spins on certain aspects. This sort of stuff makes these books incredibly valuable for GMs, even from a mechanical perspective, and I love it. Next, I want to talk about the sailing combat subsystem, the one where you're in a ship that's fighting another ship, and boarding has not necessarily occurred yet. It might at some point in the sailing combat system, in which case you will go back to the first system, but most of the time you use this, it'll be before you have actually closed into boarding melee action. This is a very interesting subsystem, and again, I would like to see how they flesh out things like these in future releases. The ships themselves are represented as 2 parts. You use vehicle rules for whoever is piloting the ship, so it'll most likely be 1 player character at the helm and a whole crew of NPCs. Maybe even the helmsman is an NPC and the GM is just kind of hand-waving how the ship moves around. And there are siege weapon rules for any onboard weapons like giant ballistae or cannons. And I know a lot of players are going to look at this and just have the immediate ick, because vehicle rules and siege weapon rules are weirdly unpopular in online discourse, but this is a sentiment I don't really get. There is this weird tendency in online discourse to view anything that shows up in the equipment page on Archives of MATEYS as being a player-facing option, but they're not all player-facing options. Vehicles and siege weapons are not meant to look and feel like just a random sword you buy in the market, and in fact, they'd be really freaking underwhelming if they were. They are weird and involved, and they take over whatever subsystem they're involved in, and that's the intent. Piloting a ship is supposed to be a whole endeavor. Firing a giant cannon that does many d12s of damage to another ship in a way that you couldn't, that is supposed to be a whole endeavor. And ultimately, all these rules are saying is, GMs, we have given you vehicle rules, we have given you siege weapon rules. All you have to do is roll tactical combat initiative just as normal, but get these items heavily involved, and you just get a new texture of combat, a combat that feels really different. It does make the recommendation that when you're rolling initiative, you should place both ships' pilots at the top of the initiative. You can make them roll against one another, but everyone should follow both of the ship's pilots. This is a recommendation they make because they don't want this weird scenario where someone aboard the ship is going first in initiative and then the other ship is like 300 feet away or something. They also don't explicitly make this recommendation, but I'm making this one. You should probably use 10-foot squares, just like skirmish rules from Battlecry, if and when you run naval combat, because it'll help you capture the scale of what ship-to-ship combat should feel like. It does recommend keeping the ships relatively close, mainly because Paizo doesn't want you to bully your melee players, but also to ensure that characters just have things to do other than spending all of their actions on vehicles and siege weapons. Ultimately, one of the reasons people get the ick for vehicle and siege rules is because they built their characters to play those characters. They shouldn't feel like they're just using the vehicle and siege rules either. So the goal of the subsystem is sort of to have vehicles and siege weapons function as mini action taxes and tactical considerations that change up the flow of battle. But ultimately, the spellcaster who wants to throw fireball onto the other ship's deck should be allowed to. So make sure the ships are not like miles away from one another when the combat starts. Make sure they're like maybe 100 feet away. Maybe the first turn or two can have purely siege weapon vehicle rules salvos, and then once the opening salvos are done, maybe some of the characters close in, but the ones who specialize in these kinds of things can stay back and use them. And of course, you should make sure that your players have NPC allies when you run this system, because it can ease up the load on the action intense part of the rules. For example, if one of the players is manning a cannon, having say 2 NPC crew members helping them load the cannon will mean the player is not just doing this repetitive aim, reload, next turn, reload, launch kind of action sequence, right? You want to make sure that they're actually getting to do things other than use the siege weapon rules. Again, I know there's a lot of pessimism towards the siege weapon rules, but I think incorporating them into the environment makes sense. You cannot use siege weapons in every single combat, but they make a lot of sense in a siege, or in this case, a ship. And you absolutely should use these rules. I think they will spice up your combats if and when you're holding them on the high seas. And I'm really excited to see if the subsystem that we get for starship combat in Starfinder's tech core is going to be similar to this, because I don't think they have fleshed out siege weapon rules there just yet, and maybe that's why they didn't release with the ship combat system. But Tech Core seems like a place where they would have a whole vault of such items. And once they have that, it wouldn't be hard for them to expand these sailing combat rules to be even more fun and even more cinematic in space. And they could probably ease up some of the action economy constraints on that one, because space battles don't have to take place over the same scale as naval battles. They can take place over hundreds of miles of space, for example, and you can have boarding pods and tractor beams and all sorts of weird stuff. So I'm really excited to see how any lessons they might have learned while developing the system translate over to Starfinder. Next, I wanted to talk about some of the interesting items in this book. I only shortlisted 4-ish that stood out to me, and there are a lot more items in this book than that. Most of them have some kind of regional association, so if they're uncommon or rare, you may have to talk to your GM about allowing them at your tables. That being said, I did not foresee too many balance issues being caused by many of them, so it should be fine. The first one that stood out to me was the Golden Wings. The level 3 version, the base version, is just a way to get a leap in any direction, and honestly, it's not that impressive for its cost. It also has this odd flavor downside of worsening your stealth checks after you do it, and I'm not sure why it's there, but a once per day activation that gives you 10 minutes of leaping is meh, whatever. There are better ways to get leaps, including gadgets like blast boots. And as you get to higher levels, this leap will feel really obsolete because the Emerald Grasshopper exists. What I really care about, though, is the level 9 and level 17 versions of this item. They give you once per day fly speed activations, and that is actually pretty good. Notably, since this is a worn cloak, it can stack with a use of something like winged sandals. So if you're building a character that really needs to be able to get up into the air, you can stack multiple ways of getting up there, getting a fly speed for that level range between 9 and say 15-ish, where fly speeds are generally once per day activations. Once you get past that level range and you're able to just get permanent fly speeds, this item will feel a little obsolete, though it may still be worth it depending on what other items you want in those slots. The next one that stood out to me is the Bloodstride boots, and this is actually impressive. Boots generally have some really stiff competition because no matter how good a pair of boots you buy, will they compete with the boots of bounding, and especially the greater boots of bounding? Odds are they won't. Most boots are not as good as the one that just give you the improvement to land speed. A few options like winged sandals will compete, but most boots are not really that good. The Bloodstride boots actually are that good because they let you teleport once per hour with the effect of Translocate. That's pretty good. Translocate is a useful spell to have. Level 13 plus is the level range where the GM might start using things like Wall of Force against your party, and just having on-demand Translocate is pretty damn good. There is also a once per day activation you can use to teleport 100 miles. I am not sure how often that will come up, but maybe it may come up situationally in your campaign, like you are scouting or spying for your party in another city and using this as a get out of jail for free card. The 1 minute activation seems like a mostly flavor thing. The thing that is to care about is the once per hour 2-action Translocate that you get pretty much unconditionally. Another item that stood out to me, and this is a good low level one, is the Coral Aspect. This is something a lot of tanks are going to be interested in. What it says is that once you activate it once per day, for the next minute, creatures that are one size or more smaller than you can now share your space. And when allies do so, they gain a +2 circumstance bonus to their AC and resistance 5 to any damage caused by a creature sharing the same space as you. This is honestly a pretty good option for tanks. Tanks like the Guardian and Champion already have some incentive to be of a large size. And if you can now also have allies sharing the space with you, you can, 1, take away the downsides of being large when you're in confined spaces, 2, provide some unconditional protection to your allies while they're sharing your space, and 3, provide some conditional protection on top of that if the circumstances are right. For 80 gold and a mask slot, this is a pretty good item to consider. And finally, there is the Hydration Cloak. There's a little bit about this cloak being a good way for aquatic ancestries to sustain themselves outside of the water. That is mostly a flavor thing. The main thing to care about is the once per day water walk that you can give yourself with this item. Next up, I wanted to talk about some of the new feat options presented in this book. The feats in this book go into roughly 3 categories. Red Mantis feats, though weirdly, they don't require you to have any kind of a Red Mantis archetype involved. They're simply class feats that a rogue or investigator picks, depending on which feat it is, if they're part of the Red Mantis assassins. And as is the case with all uncommon feats, you can just ask your GM for access to them without being a Red Mantis assassin. Then there's a line of feats for the pirate archetype, and nothing really stood out for me in that. And then finally, there's a whole bunch of what they called dashing class feats for some combination of swashbuckler, gunslinger, and fighter that are all supposed to be various kinds of stunts. Many of them are cool in theory, but they seem just fine overall. You might pick them. Many of them seem decent to consider. I will talk about a few of the standouts over here. First up, there is the Fog Cloak. This is one of those Red Mantis feats for rogues that I mentioned. All it says is when you are concealed by mist or fog, you are hidden rather than concealed until a creature successfully finds you via the seek action. This seems innocuous, but this is actually a huge build enabler, specifically for ranged rogues. Ranged rogues sort of have a problem in this system where it's a little hard to enable sneak attack, especially compared to your melee counterparts. I have always been a firm believer that ranged combat in Pathfinder is fine. There are many viable, powerful ranged options. The rogue is definitely a little undertuned at range though. And this is a really good build enabler for them. In fact, even if you're not part of the Red Mantis Assassins, I would suggest you talk to your GM if you're a ranged rogue about picking this feat. This feat basically reads, if you drink a misform elixir at the start of combat, you now have enemies off guard to you pretty much for the whole combat, because I would say it's unlikely for an enemy to spend a seek action just to stop being off guard to you. In fact, there's even an argument to be made of would they even bother doing it unless you were also undetected? They don't know the mechanics of your feat, right? But yeah, generally off guard is a cheap condition for melee rogues to inflict because flanking already tends to be decently easy and gang up makes it trivial to inflict. Fog Cloak is a great ranged enabler, and I hope this will unlock some playstyles for rogues that until now were considered a tad bit underpowered. Next, I wanted to talk about Cannonball Fall, and I love this feat. This feat is something that a lot of us, especially swashbuckler players, probably have thought about doing at one point or another. Leaping onto an enemy from a tall height and dealing them damage and potentially inflicting a negative condition. And usually this falls to GM improvisation. You have to figure out, are there enough consequences for attempting something like this? And I have had to do so at my own table as well, for a swashbuckler player if you hadn't guessed. And this feat is a great example of how to take something that anybody should be able to attempt, and while normally there'd be consequences or circumstantial stuff behind it, or difficulties that make it inconsistent, some characters with a feat get to get the best possible version of this. So the way this works is, you can leap onto an enemy within 10 feet horizontally of you, and a vertical cap, which is 40 feet at the point you get this at level 8, and it caps out at 100 feet when you're level 20, and they have to make a saving throw. You take fall damage as normal, as if that enemy wasn't there, and this means your fall damage is affected by things like catfall or bouncy goblin, etc. The enemy's damage from this, however, is not affected by any of those things. They take damage based on the damage you would have theoretically taken for this fall. On a critical success, none. On a success, a quarter of that theoretical damage. On a failure, half that damage, and they're knocked prone. And on a critical failure, they're knocked prone, take the full damage, and become stunned 1. This is a pretty good situational feat. If you're in a campaign where verticality comes up often, like say a naval combat campaign where you have ships' riggings and things to swing on, you are going to probably make use of this feat decently often. Instead of just leaping across to the other ship during a boarding combat, you swing in on a rope, land on an enemy, deal a bunch of damage for an action you would have had to take anyways. The fact that there are built-in combo potential, the fact that you can reduce your damage without reducing the damage the enemy would take, and the fact that there are circumstances that can make it better. For example, you don't land prone even if you don't reduce all of the damage you would have taken, so long as you had something to stabilize your fall, like a rope or a wall to push off of. All of these factors make this feat very good in the situations it's built for, even if it is a narrow situation, and I love it. Really, the one and only problem with this feat is that fighters at levels 6 to 12 have fantastic other feat options, so they'll probably not end up picking these. But I can see this feat getting some use on other characters. The next thing I want to talk about is a good feat. Heartless Debilitations. It is just a couple of new debilitation options for rogues, again with the Red Mantis Assassin flavor, and it's not subclass specific like a lot of the follow-up debilitations are. The two options you get are Weakness 5 to bleed and poison damage for one of them, and Frightened 1 for the other. Now there is a sort of a confusion I have because Frightened 1 is something that expires at the end of the target's turn, whereas debilitations expire at the start of the rogue's turn. I don't know where the Frightened 1 is supposed to expire. I would assume it still expires at the end of the enemy's turn, but there are arguments to be made either way. Definitely clarify with your GM how this will work. If it lasts till the start of the rogue's turn, it's probably just better than the other -1 debilitations, like the Clumsy one, for example. So it's probably correct for it to expire at the end of the enemy's turn, in which case it's still a strong debilitation. Notably, again, a boon for ranged rogues because you can self-enable Dread Striker. So you can open with Fog Cloak, you can take a couple of strikes, and if you apply this debilitation, now you could guarantee sneak attack on following turns, even if they seek you and you're concealed rather than hidden. And the weakness to bleed, that is of course situational, but if you build around it, it can be fantastic. For example, if you're a rogue and there's a swashbuckler in the party doing bleeding finisher, you're probably gonna love weakness 5 to bleed damage. Right now, the only rogue subclass that can inflict a weakness that your party can exploit is the Ruffian, and now every rogue is able to do it, provided your GM allows this feat. And finally, this was an interesting level 8 feat. I think it's a good defensive reaction to have. Anytime somebody within your reach causes you to fall or knocks you prone, you can make an athletics check to try to get them to fall with you as well, or be knocked prone. Now, I don't know how often the falling part of this comes up. I think if you're in danger of falling off the edge, the best thing to do isn't this feat, it is to position yourself so you're not falling off the edge. But being knocked prone is something that's going to come up relatively often. Enemies have options like knockdown and improved knockdown, and even if they don't, athletics to trip players is a good tactic for GMs to use. And having a reaction that potentially knocks the enemy prone as well, it's pretty nice. You will potentially negate the benefit they would have had of attacking you while you were prone and thus off guard, or waste an action if they choose to stand up. This might also trigger your party's reactions, or they might just be forced to stay down because they don't want to do those things, and then the rest of your party, especially ranged attackers, now benefit from the enemy being off guard and prone. So this seems like a pretty good feat. The only real downside of this is that this is at fighter level 8, and the fighter level 6 to 12 range is so stacked with good feats that this might get forgotten, but it is still a good feat, and depending on the campaign you're in, you might consider it. Then, this book adds a handful of new spells, and I wanted to highlight 2 of them. One, because it is fantastic, and the other because I have no idea how it's supposed to work. And in fact, I have so little idea how it's supposed to work that it is now raising questions about how other spells that I thought I knew how they work. So let's talk about that confusing one first. Undertow. This is a primal spell with the incapacitation and water traits. It creates a 20-foot burst of water that is supposed to basically be 20 feet deep of water. It's a little confusing that this doesn't seem to need a container of any kind. It can just live free-floating almost like an aqueous orb. And enemies swimming through it swim against your spell DC. Anyone starting their turn in the area must attempt a fortitude save. On a success, they take 2d6 bludgeoning damage. On a failure, they take double that damage and have a penalty to swimming or a penalty to swim speed if they have one. And on a critical failure, they're further pulled 10 feet down. And that is the part that is confusing me. This spell seems to be able to just create this area of water. Is the implication of the critical failure that if you create an area of water, targets within it float to the top of it as you cast it? I did not know that that was supposed to be the implication, but that's my interpretation here, right? Because why would that be a critical failure effect otherwise? That seems only 46 bludgeoning damage, a penalty to swimming, and being pulled 10 feet down on an incapacitation spell? I don't fully comprehend why the 10-foot down thing exists, unless the intention has always been that when you put up a wall of water, a pillar of water, creatures float to the top of it and only sink with additional effort. Note that if that is Paizo's rule's intent, and has always been Paizo's rule intent, this closes a common loophole that people talk about, suffocating enemies inside a wall of water. The assumption that I, and as far as I know, most of the player base has been making is that when you put up a wall of water, if an enemy is inside it, they are now just underwater and thus holding their breath. And then if you have a way to make them stop holding their breath, like say the Laughing Fit spell, which makes them laugh, they will immediately start suffocating and drowning. And this has always been a cheesy combo, which no reasonable GM would allow at your tables, but this spell to me implies that this combo never existed. Were you always intended to float to the top of a wall of water when it was cast? I don't know, that seems like it to me. Either way, this is a pretty situational spell. I cannot imagine seeing much use out of it when compared to other heavy hitters at 3rd rank. I just thought it was interesting that what rules implications the critical failure effect has. And then there is a fantastic new occult spell. 2nd rank spell named with friends like these. It targets 2 creatures within 30 feet of you, hits their will, because it's occult, and of course the occult spell is a 30-foot spell that targets will, but on a success, the creature becomes sickened 1. On a failure, they become sickened 2, and while they're sickened this way, they don't treat one another as allies. The not treating each other as allies part is circumstantial. It prevents them from healing one another, it prevents them from flanking with one another. It is nice, but the sickened 2 is the meat of this spell. And then the critical failure is you can't end move actions within 10 feet of one another while sickened. This is amazing, and this doesn't even have the incapacitation trait. This is exploitable. If you're fighting multiple enemies, them not being allowed to end close to one another means a party with proactive positioning is genuinely able to just stop enemies from positioning themselves at all in any kind of a favorable way, especially in cramped spaces. And even without the critical failure, sickened 1 on a success is good. Ghoulish Cravings has always been a good spell, even though it has a secret action tax of needing reach spell, right? This doesn't need reach spell, so it's 2 actions, not 3 actions, hits multiple targets, and inflicts sickened 1 on a success, sickened 2 on a failure. And as you heighten it, this is the first time I've seen this kind of templating. Rather than saying at 5th rank it targets 5 creatures, or whatever, at like 8th rank it targets 10 creatures, this spell says that for every 2 ranks you heighten it, it targets 1 additional creature. I wish more spells were templated this way. I wish Fear just said, heighten +1, you target 1 additional creature. I wish Slow said something like that, but heighten +2. And I wish Synesthesia said something like that. I feel like smoothing out multi-target heightening is a good design space, and the fact that they put it on this common spell means they'll be using it more in the future, and I am excited for that. But even setting aside the future design space, this is a fantastic new occult spell that every single occult spellcaster should be considering. And finally, I wanted to highlight one stat block in this book just to showcase how cool the NPCs in this book, and honestly, in most of Pathfinder's GM guidelines, are. I wanted to highlight the Bone Ship. Now, the Bone Ship is something that was already in Bestiary 3. I think it was reprinted pretty much as is. I didn't see any major differences, but it got reprinted into the remaster with Lost Omens High Seas, and the Bone Ship is one of my favorite stat blocks in this system. It kind of has everything going for it. It is interesting as a boss monster, like a level 15 party going up against this. It's going to be a fun set-piece battle. But it's also interesting when it shows up in multitudes to threaten a level 20 party, because now it's an entirely different dynamic. In my campaign where I played a wizard, our level 20 party did go up against a couple of bone ships and a mini-boss, and it was the most interesting encounter we've ever had. Just take a look at all of the things it has going for it. It has a whole host of interesting resistances because it's a ship. It has the skeleton crew feature, which gives it a lot of protection against mental effects, but rewards players who had the forethought of picking mental effects that say any number of target creatures or target a massive area. It has a very thematic and cinematic aura, and obviously creatures in high-level Pathfinder tend to have dangerous auras. It has dangerous melee options and ranged options. At range, it has the ability to attach a chain to one of the players and reel them in. It has a spell-like effect. It has the ability to drag players around with the hull of the ship, either with the chain shot or with the keel haul effect, which is a rejig of an existing monster action called Trample. There are just so many things you can do with this set-piece boss monster, and also, when it's a minion, it's still interesting to fight against. I love when NPC stat blocks just have this whole host of options, because these are the kinds of things that force players to use spells they otherwise may not have used. Look at all those resistances. Look at the fact that it is pretty scary to engage in both at range and in melee. It forces parties to vary up their tactics, and that is always good. And of course, Pathfinder is full of interesting NPCs in high-level play. I just wanted to highlight this one because I loved fighting against it in the adventure path I saw it in, and now that it's been reprinted, it's going to be more visible for GMs who may not have been familiar with the pre-remaster version of this, right? That's all I have to say for today's video, folks. This was my review of Pathfinder Lost Omens High Seas. I have accidentally skipped a surprising number of reviews because of the Paizo store change. I did not get notifications that I got these books in my collection. I might trickle in reviews of some of them at some or the other point as I continue the rest of my videos, but I promise you, my next video is going to be that Marshall's focused video that I promised all of you, and I'm going to continue talking about Marshall's for a little bit for the next few months. If you like this content, please like and comment. If you'd like to see my future videos, please subscribe to the channel and consider clicking the channel notification button. If you want to directly support me, consider joining a channel membership. And of course, you can always support all Pathfinder creators, not just me, by engaging in Pathfinder, by playing it, by buying the books online, buying the PDFs online, etc. I don't know if y'all saw the news about the Paizo restructuring, but any of you who did knows how important it is that we continue to support the company that is making this game that we all love to play. I hope to see you next time, folks. Mathfinder out.